From the library of the New York Stock Exchange at the corner of Wall and Broad Streets in New York City, you're inside the Ice House, our podcast from Intercontinental Exchange on markets, leadership, and vision in global business. The dream drivers that have made the NYSE an indispensable institution of global growth for over 225 years. Each week, we feature stories of those who hatch plans, create jobs, and harness the engine of capitalism. Right here, right now at the NYSE and at ICE's 12 exchanges and 6 clearinghouses around the world. And now welcome inside the Ice House. Here's your host, Josh King of Intercontinental Exchange.
Nature or nurture? It's the age-old question. You grow up in Gaza, in the Palestinian territory, your opportunities are going to be dramatically different, probably, than if you grow up 44 miles to the north in Tel Aviv. You grow up in Chelsea, Massachusetts, a little north of Boston, which was constantly beset by economic distress, and in 1973, as I recall, suffered a conflagration that burned 18 acres to the ground. Your chances of success might be dramatically different than if you grew up in Newton, a perennially affluent suburb a little west of Boston, just about 10 miles away from Chelsea. Nature versus nurture. Our guest today, Ian Bremmer, was one of those kids from Chelsea. I was one of those kids from Newton. After getting his PhD in political science from Stanford in 1994, Ian, at 25, became the youngest ever national fellow of the Hoover Institution. At 25, I was selling cellular phones in the British Virgin Islands, listening to Jimmy Buffett and whiling away the full moon at the Bomba Shack. So nurture counts for a lot. In his latest book, Us versus Them, The Failure of Globalism, Bremmer writes, a kid born on the hard edge of a great American city, the child of a single mother, my dad died when I was 4, who, with uncommon singleness of purpose, walked 2 boys past every trap and pushed us towards success. One small sample of the American dream. That's from Ian Bremmer in Us versus Them. Nature versus nurture. Us versus them. The American dream, the Chinese dream, the European Union dream, the Middle East dream. When you're Ian Bremmer, you're constantly on a plane, on the phone, on the air, analyzing the current status of these and so many other geopolitical dreams and the risks they entail. As the year winds to a close, Ian's passport is put away for the final week of 2018, and he's sipping a cup of eggnog with us in the library of the New York Stock Exchange. Our conversation with Ian Bremmer, right after this.
We began with a vision to transform energy trading through technology, creating a modern, accessible marketplace that leveled the playing field and drove transparency. Today, Intercontinental Exchange operates markets around the world. We provide data people rely on and connect participants to support investing, trading, hedging, and capital raising, driving the world forward. Well-functioning markets play a critical role in advancing economies and create opportunities for those who build them, and we innovate to ensure our markets serve the world every step of the way. When you turn on a light switch, we help ensure that energy is priced efficiently. From fields to your cup each day, from farms to your table, and products that enable financial opportunity. At Intercontinental Exchange, we build, operate, and advance global financial and commodity markets. It starts here.
Our guest today, Ian Bremmer, is the president and founder of Eurasia Group, a leading global political research and consulting firm. He's the author of 9 books, including Every Nation for Itself, Winners and Losers in the GZERO World, Superpower, 3 Choices for Americans' Role in the World, and his latest, which I talked about earlier in the introduction, Us versus Them, The Failure of Globalism, which is a New York Times bestseller. Ian's a regular contributor to news networks and several publications, including Time Magazine, where he is the foreign affairs columnist and editor-at-large. He's also a professor at NYU, so a neighbor of mine in Greenwich Village, and today the bell ringer of the New York Stock Exchange, celebrating the first full year of GZERO Media, which I was late to until I saw my friend Ben White do 60 seconds on the midterms and thought, so cool. I can miss 3 hours of Morning Joe and get smart on the midterms in just about a minute. Welcome, Ian, to the Ice House.
Good to be with you.
I saw the bio on your Twitter page. Interesting reference. If you lived here, you'd be home now. Perhaps a reference to that sign we saw as kids waiting in traffic on Storrow Drive as we crawled our way toward the Callahan Tunnel.
Oh my God, you're the only person that actually gets that initial reference, you know? And it's funny because as a kid that grew up in the projects, I remember it was right across from the Museum of Science at the other side of Charles River. And I would see that sign and I would go, oh my God, can you imagine what it would be like if you lived here? You'd be home now. But of course, it's much more...
We all thought that.
But it's much more existential than that. It's also, I mean, especially where we all live virtual lives and digital lives and we're all getting our heads kind of blown up by things we don't agree with. If you lived here, meaning if you also lived on this Twitter feed, you'd be home now. It'd be okay, right? You wouldn't take yourself so seriously. It wouldn't be such a big deal. But yes, that is exactly, it was that sign that...
Not enough Bostonians are reading the bio on your Twitter page, unfortunately,
that's or
of
true.
A certain age. I don't know, is the sign still up there?
I don't know. It's not, sadly.
So
it's been gone for at least a decade. So.
I mean, it is a decent metaphor for us versus them, those who live in the gleaming condos along the Charles River versus those who tough it out on the mean streets of Chelsea.
This was a book I should have written 10 years ago. After the financial crisis, I thought about writing this book, and I didn't, because it was pretty clear that the Occupy Wall Street movement, right across the street from where we are right now, was not going to be around for very long. And I'm like, well, I could write this book, and by the time it comes out, no one's going to care. And that was analytically correct, but it was a really bad reason not to write the book because, you know, of course, these issues are getting worse, and this environment of us versus them is becoming weaponized, both in our country and around the world. And it made me feel like, you know, enough already. I have to get a little more personal with this message.
Your high school offered a program, Teach a Kid How America Works. As you write, you leaped at the chance to join. What did you learn once you were inside one of those buildings of Boston's green and gold skyline, except that it had the deepest carpet you'd ever seen?
Just the fact that there was such an environment out there. I just, you know, when you're a kid and you've never been in a city and you've never been up a fast elevator and you don't know what these people in these offices do. I mean, you've maybe seen them on TV or in a movie, but they don't really exist in real life. And then suddenly, along with high school friends, I'm brought into this environment every week and I'm experiencing something that is completely different. Not that I necessarily wanted to become a banker or a corporate executive, but simply that I was then suddenly had a few people around me that said, this is an option for you. This is something that you could potentially do. That message, my mother did everything for my brother and I to have every possible opportunity, but she wouldn't have known how to articulate that potential path, because she'd never experienced it. So I think maybe the fact that it was really deep carpet sounds stupid, but I'd never had really deep carpet. Like, I remember that just because it was so obviously different. It reminded me as much as the first time when I read 1984 by George Orwell, and when the main character suddenly finds out what it's like to be a part of the elite and has a glass of wine or real coffee for the first time. That feels very dystopian. But the fact is that all of us experience sudden moments in our lives where we're exposed to something completely different from everything that we've been brought up to believe is possible. And for me, that was one.
So in 1984, John Silber is president of Boston University. He'll eventually go on to run for governor of Massachusetts. But along the way, while at BU, he has this ambitious project to remake Chelsea. I don't know when the last time you visited Chelsea was. You write about it a little bit in Us Versus Them. But as history, looking back in hindsight, John Silber, hero or goat for Chelsea?
Oh, I guess a little of both. I mean, look, the fact is that we lost our right to have a mayor in Chelsea. And I go back quite a bit, actually, because, it's where I'm from. In fact, one thing that I did was Sergei Kirienko, the former prime minister of Russia, during the crisis in 1998, I invited and brought him to the United States right after I started my company. And he was a friend. And he had just gotten pummeled at an event we did at Harvard because, there was suddenly a default and a devaluation at the same time. So the markets were not treating him kindly. And I told him he needed a roast beef sandwich at Kelly's Roast Beef. And so I brought him to Kelly's Roast Beef. Not much.
Not Centarpio's Pizza? That's where you got to bring him.
No, the New Bridge Cafe, I could have done that too. But the fact is, here he is on Revere Beach. And he was not expecting much. And he had the first one, and then he had a second one. And things felt a little bit better. So, you have nostalgia for your places. Why am I talking to you about that? Chelsea, Silver. Because when I was in high school, I was the aide for Mayor James D. Mitchell in high school. And I was something like 12 or 13 years old. And Mitchell he's a smart guy. He liked me. He had a temper. He drank a lot. And at one point, we had some bomb threats, and there was big flooding, and there was a family that only spoke Vietnamese, and I had to find a translator because there were live electrical wires, and we didn't want them to die. And it was crazy. And I remember there was supposed to be a press conference, and he was deep in his cups and did not want to talk to the press. So he gave me the talking points.
All at 12 years old.
At 12. And so I remember there were a bunch of folks from the media, including R.D. Saul, who was one of...
The great R.D. Saul.
The great R.D. Saul. And I came out to give the talking points, and I explained that the mayor was not going to be there. And he was not going to put me on camera, and he demanded to talk to the mayor. I'm like, well, this is all you're getting, my friend. So if you don't want, so he took my statement, and that was that, and they put it out. But I unfortunately did not manage to deliver his live on television.
It is now 10:15, so 45 minutes after you've rung the opening bell. What brought you to the New York Stock Exchange today?
Oh, we've worked together with the New York Stock Exchange for, I think, about 15 years, done a lot of events with the listed company CEOs, the board, Davos, you name it. I rang the bell about 10 years ago for Eurasia Group, a company I started back in 1998. And now we've having the first anniversary of GZERO Media, a new media company that we've started, because if you watch the media these days, it doesn't feel good. It feels inauthentic. It feels increasingly like they're telling you an us versus them story. And I didn't think that was okay. So that's why I started a year ago. And I'm delighted to now have all of these, sort of new content delivery vehicles. We can help have a conversation with particularly young people all over the world. We've got almost 5 million followers. We've got a show on public television. And 1 year in, we've announced we've got our first anniversary, and we're celebrating it right here with you on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. What a great place to do that.
We're going to talk a lot more about GZERO in a few minutes, but you and I, when we were kids, I think we had our first glimpses of what we started to learn was the G7. And there was Ronald Reagan and Francois Mitterrand and Margaret Thatcher and Brian Mulroney and the other leaders of the industrialized countries. And then there was the G20. And here comes Ian Bremmer with GZERO. Just give us the origin of this name versus the G's that we've grown up with.
I remember, I'll tell you the exact origin, is I was watching a morning show before work. I was on the treadmill, and I saw the former National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, after a G20 meeting, and the G20, where the world's most powerful 20 economies, their heads of state, meet. And it was a fairly dysfunctional group because they don't agree on much. And that was true back then. It's certainly even more true now. I mean, you've got countries like China and Saudi Arabia who have state-owned and run economies, who have authoritarian political systems. Then you have the United States and France and Canada, which are free market representative democracies and Republican democracies. So it didn't work very well. And he said, it's not really a G20. What it really is a G2. It's really the United States and China that behind the scenes are running things, and they can't really admit to that, but that's what we're evolving towards. And I could not have disagreed more with Zbigniew Brzezinski. I thought it was so ridiculous that this man who always had a bee in his bonnet about the Russians, the former Soviets, and so anything he could do to put them down and put the Chinese up, and he was being ideologically driven to say that actually it's all about the U.S.-China. And I can't stand it when really smart people use a platform to spin a story, to be ideological, to analytically deceive folks, right? So it upset me. And I thought to myself, how ridiculous. He didn't even get the right number. That the G20 isn't working, but he picked the 2 as opposed to what it really is, the 0, that there isn't leadership. There increasingly is an absence of global leadership. We're going through this unusual vacuum that post-American order, and no one runs it. And it's going to take some time before we figure out what the next order is. And he's not admitting that. So then I thought to myself, GZERO, that's kind of cool. Let me look up who else has been talking about that. So I get back to my house an hour later from the gym, and I go online to look up who else has used the term GZERO and in what context, what other political scientists thought that was, sort of correct and proper. And it didn't exist. It literally didn't exist. And that's when you have this, sort of direct bifurcated analytic moment that really, it's a horrifying and exciting moment when you realize on the one hand, oh, damn, I have to write a book. And wow, this is extraordinary. I've got this really cool idea that I can be the first to actually write about it. The best ideas are the ones that are really obvious after the fact, but no one actually thought about them until then. And that was kind of the way GZERO came to mind. So
still sweating from the treadmill, you're in front of your computer. How long does it take you to crank out GZERO?
Oh, it was at least by afternoon. I mean, I wasn't done. But no, I immediately took an hour and wrote out everything I could think of that was in my head around what that would mean. That was eventually the structure for a book that came out a year and a half later. But in this case, the first time I've ever done this with a book, I actually wrote a big article that became the cover of Foreign Affairs magazine a solid year before it, because I recognized that anything that was that obvious, at least to me, was probably going to be obvious to more people as the world moved in that direction. And I just wanted to get it out there, have people start talking about it.
You're such a prolific and fast writer. I was just reading your newest weekly note this morning. You're fresh off the plane from the Arab Strategy Forum in the United Arab Emirates. Your last trip of the year, as you write, and perhaps a hopeful meeting this year, as that you seem to detect more willingness to talk and negotiate than you've seen on your prior trips. What did you learn, and what's the state of play in the Middle East? So
the big change, of course, since the last time I visited some 6 months ago, is the extraordinary, now almost 2 months of constant media around the murder of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who was a writer for the Washington Post. The Emiratis are the Saudis' best ally, and I met with pretty much their entire leadership right while I was there. They were deeply disappointed with Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, who very credibly has been now pointed as having known about, indeed probably ordered, that murder. And what's interesting is that everyone in the United States is writing about this as if it is oh my God, can you believe that the United States is sticking with the Saudis given all of this data? Because, of course, the journalists are writing about a fellow journalist, and you understand that. But actually, there's a lot going on as a consequence of this. First thing is that Mohammed bin Salman was doing a lot of stuff in the region that America did not like. Number one, he actually started a blockade, diplomatic and economic blockade. In fact, he's even building a moat between Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And the United States has its most important military base in the Gulf, in Qatar. So we obviously don't like to see that. Secondly, you have a war going on in Yemen, which has been discussed, including by the United Nations, as the worst potential humanitarian crisis in the world. That the Saudis have been pursuing that war with their military equipment, but the Americans have been helping them and providing a lot of support, intel, drones, you name it. And we do not want them to do either of those two things. And now that Mohammed bin Salman is under all this pressure, they have invited the Qataris to a Gulf Cooperation Council meeting in Saudi Arabia. Mohammed bin Salman met with the Qatari State Minister for Foreign Affairs directly while they were there. The Kuwaitis said that we need the media to calm down in the region about this. There was a communique at the end signed unanimously by all of the members, including Saudi Arabia and Qatar, saying that we want to work together economically, diplomatically. This is a big step forward, a win even for the Americans. So too, in the last several days, we now have a ceasefire that has been agreed to in the port of Hodeidah, which is where 80% of all import gets into Yemen, so the people will not starve. Literally, and they'll be able to get medical equipment. That is a big deal. The Americans have wanted that to happen for over a year. So we have suddenly two really good news stories coming out of Saudi Arabia because of pressure on Mohammed bin Salman. Unfortunately, Trump can't take credit for those things because he's been publicly out in front saying this is my guy and we're selling him a lot of weapons. But the Republicans in Senate...
But our very own U.S. Senate sort of is a hero toward the end of the year.
That's right. The Republicans in Senate look like a hero and very much on top of this issue at the end of the year. The other side of this story, if you want to just follow up on it quickly, is that domestically, Mohammed bin Salman has been a revolutionary reformer. He's the one that got the religious police off the streets. He's the one that pushed to get cinemas open for young people so that they have something to do, more sports, and let men and women actually watch those sports together. You know, there was a big event with a DJ that actually had Saudi and men, young women together, like celebrating. You never see this in Saudi Arabia. So he's actually been moving a lot. And a lot of those reforms are truly not popular inside the elites, the older elites in Saudi Arabia don't want to see that happen. I now suspect that they will be stillborn or at least stalled for some period of time because he's lost a lot of support. So dramatic changes coming out of the kingdom and the Middle East, but not the ones that most people are talking about right here.
So perhaps a little bit of good news coming out of the Middle East toward the end of the year. While you're in the UAE, a couple thousand miles to the northwest in London, sort of a calamitous week.
British Prime Minister Theresa May is safe, at least for the moment. Just a few moments ago, May survived a no-confidence vote from her own party. Backlash had been growing for a while from pro-Brexit lawmakers frustrated with her negotiations to leave the European Union, criticizing her for not making a completely clean break in the negotiations. CNN's Bianca Nobilo is in London for us. And Bianca, despite the fact that Prime Minister May is safe for the next year, the Brexit plan is still in chaos. March 29th is the agreed-upon date that England will leave the EU.
Theresa May cancels her vote on Brexit. You say she's declared, in your note, she's declared she'll work on further reassurances from the European Union, but they've no incentive to change their position. My favorite quote of the week came from the Prime Minister of tiny, wealthy, and indifferent Luxembourg, which shrugged off a question of a potential no-deal Brexit crisis with a look of bemusement and replied, quote, "Brexit was a choice of the UK, not of us." So what next? So huge implications for so many companies involved in trading in London, in the futures market, in the oil market, and perhaps, you know, Prime Minister May, who was originally, as you write, a person who voted to remain, she's now carrying this on her shoulders. Are we going to see another people's referendum?
It is possible. It amuses me greatly that they're calling it a people's vote, because it does make you beg the question of what the hell was it the first time
when
around.
52 voted the other way.
52% voted the other way. You know, I think they should at least have a 2 out of 3, a 4 out of 7, right? I mean, you know, it doesn't seem fair that like the next one suddenly counts. But look, the point is that it's one thing to support. There are a lot of good reasons to support Brexit. There are a lot of reasons to believe that, look, Europe is falling apart, its governance is poor, it's getting harder, it's too big, and there are issues of sovereignty in terms of the way that, you know, migrants are, you know, dealt with and the rest that increasingly large numbers of the European population as a whole do not like. So I understand why many Brits would support a Brexit referendum. That is very different from a credible belief that you would be able to implement on Brexit in a way that would allow the UK economy and political system to thrive. They could not. It reminds me of Steve Bannon when he became chief strategist in the United States for Trump, and he had very good reasons to believe that the US and China were heading for tensions, and his argument was that means we should hit them now while they're weaker as opposed to later when they're strong, which makes sense if you think you can execute on it. But when you have an electoral cycle every 2 years that lasts for roughly 2 years, and when the corporations aren't on your side, and when you have a government that strongly disagrees about what to do with China internally between hardliners and softliners, and Trump just looking for the next deal that he can cut irrespective of whether it's good for the Americans strategically, then it doesn't matter if you have the right theory, you can't execute on it. And that is the problem that the Brits have right now. They can't get a vote through, they can't get a deal through, and because it is not knife-edge urgent going to cause a calamity in the British economy, until it does, until you are like at that point where if we don't vote for this now, we're going to experience a massive recession or worse, you can't get British political figures to do what's in the long-term interest of the country. They only do what's in the short-term interest of their party, of their constituency, of themselves. And anyone in a democracy knows how this feels, particularly in a larger democracy that feels increasingly rigged. And that's why a lot of people in these countries are saying we're really sick of all of these truth tellers that may have book smarts, they may know their science, but they don't care about me. And I'm sick of voting for people that tell the quote-unquote truth but don't do anything for me and my family. I'd rather vote for someone else.
Ian, you begin us versus them with this rhetorical question. Why do Palestinians throw rocks? You might as easily ask, why do kids from Chelsea throw rocks, or Ferguson, Missouri, or migrants approach the U.S. border, or people in the U.K. angry about immigration? Why do they throw rocks? So tell me, why do Palestinians and so many others throw rocks?
I mean, kids from Chelsea did throw rocks. The problem was it was at me. But Palestinians, why do Palestinians throw rocks? They throw rocks because they feel like they've been lied to for decades. They feel like the system is rigged against them. And by the way, when I say they've been lied to for decades, I don't just mean by Israelis or Americans or the UN or the Europeans promising boycotts or the Saudis or the Egyptians saying they're going to help them. I mean, even by their own government, their own Palestinian Authority that hasn't gotten it done for them. And so I think that if you are Palestinian and you see an Israeli Defense Force member, you throw a rock not because you think it's going to make your life better. Once you throw it, you run away. You understand that this is a dangerous thing to do, but it gives you agency. It gives you a voice. It says that you matter. I mean, I could have been even more urgent and desperate about it. Why do prisoners go on hunger strike? Because it tells themselves that they still matter, that they still have the ability, they have free will. Human beings, no matter how tough your situation is, will not give up their free will. And I think that, you know, when Trump ran for office and said the system is rigged, that was probably the truest words he has uttered in his entire life. I think that the system is rigged is something that my mother, if she was still alive today, she would have voted for that. And my brother did, by the way, and I write about that in the book too. And I'm deeply empathetic to people that feel like for decades, those in power have found ways to make the system work much better for them and their family and their friends, and forgotten about the average American, so much so that the American dream today does not feel real for a majority of our co-citizens.
So if President Trump is right and the system is rigged, how do you square with the words that he speaks when he orders the 82nd Airborne to the border of the U.S.-Mexico and says, if the migrants do throw rocks toward our troops, treat them as bullets and respond with rules of engagement thusly?
Oh, well, I think if you want to effectively ensure that your people are going to rally for you and you don't have long-term solutions for them, you're not really going to turn their economic lives around. And that's with the economy doing well, by the way. Never mind when the economy takes a downturn, as it eventually does, or will. It's very important to dehumanize the other. It's very important to say that Haitians are coming here to bring AIDS, that Mexicans are coming to rape and pillage and criminalize, that Nigerians will never go back to their huts if we let them into the U.S. All things that Trump has said. Does he actually believe them? I doubt it. But it's an effective rhetorical flourish, because if you don't do that, then human beings are more likely to see these people as fellow human beings and make connections with them. It's much harder to treat them in ways that feels inhumane. I mean, I'd have a much harder time eating battery chickens if you forced me to see the way we treat them. But as long as I go to a store and pick them up in a way that seems prepackaged and fine, then I have no problem continuing that. That doesn't make me a bad person, at least fundamentally, I don't think it does. But it does make me a little lazy and weak. And I think that political leaders know how to play on that.
So we've been at this conversation now for a little bit. We've just scratched the surface of a half dozen issues so far, Ian. And I said in the introduction that I was just turned on to GZERO Media a few weeks ago because I was watching my friend Ben White's Twitter feed. I see him analyzing the midterm elections in 60 seconds.
Hi, it's Ben White, Chief Economic Correspondent at Politico, with your U.S. politics in just 60 seconds. All right, let's start the clock. Number one, should Democrats use their new House majority to investigate or legislate? They've got to strike a fine balance of both. Democratic voters want vigorous oversight of the Trump administration, but they also have to show they have an agenda on health care, taxes, infrastructure. They may not pass anything, but they've got to try. Number two, will new Attorney General Matt Whitaker try to wind down the Mueller probe? Of course he will. That's why Trump put him in the job. The question is, how will Democrats react in the House, and will Republicans in the Senate next year move to protect Robert Mueller? Number three, what was the most surprising upset on Election Day? I'd say it was Staten Island, where Democrat Max Rose surprisingly won that race. Staten Island's been the red beacon in blue New York, and Democrats managed to turn it blue. Number four, who else should receive the Medal of Freedom Award from President Donald Trump? I'd say he'll give it to a toaster oven, which has done about as much, or probably much more, for America than Miriam Adelson, the wife of the GOP megadonor who Trump gave the Medal of Freedom to. All right, that's your U.S. politics in just 60 seconds. I'm Ben White from Politico.
How do you square the need to dive so deep into these issues, to travel all the way to the UAE for the meeting, to write 9 books, and yet being able to encapsulate such a big issue as the midterms in 60 seconds, the premise behind GZERO Media?
The premise behind GZERO Media is that young people will respond to authenticity. You can be wrong. They can disagree with you, but you have to be honest with them. You have to tell them what you really think, and that every single thing we will put out in GZERO Media will reflect that. And if that means that people get angry at us, if that means that some people aren't going to follow, they're going to turn us off, that's absolutely fine. And you have to recognize that as much as I would like to have serious, in-depth conversations all the time, that we don't have the temperament, the mood, or increasingly the technology for that. So you have to put it out in every format, which means 60 seconds, so that if you don't have time and you're on the fly, I can give you the top line of what some of the smartest people in the field are thinking, and it's a takeaway. And maybe we engage you enough that next time you'll dig a little deeper, right? But we have puppets, and those puppets are funny. But they have to be educational. We won't run a segment with the puppets unless there is a message you can take away that actually expresses how we honestly think about a topic, whatever that topic is. And then I have a weekly show that's on public television and on digital called GZERO World. It's 30 minutes long, and I'll have an in-depth conversation with a global leader, just like you and I are having right now. So I think you can do all of these different formats, but you've got to have clarity of message. Your content has to not fool with people, because one thing that is making young people turn off, make them feel disenfranchised, not want to bother to vote, not want to just become incredibly cynical, is because they understand that the corporates and the political leaders and the media are advertising to them. That for them, that they are the product. And that's not okay. And I think that when you have more respect for your audience and say, okay, these people actually are thinking human beings just like me, and they want to hear it from me in a legitimate, authentic way, I think then they relate and respond in a much better way.
Let's dwell on the puppets for a second. In-depth analysis of the topics that are shaping the future of the world, it is such serious business, but it's clear that there is room for some humor when you talk about these issues. This is Ian Bremmer, sort of, announcing the launch of the GZERO World PBS show. Let's have a listen.
Hi, folks. Now that GZERO World is on public television, that means bleeping out some of your favorite four-letter words. But to make it fun, we're going to let you guess what they are. First up, a discussion between Donald Trump, Angela Merkel, and Vladimir Putin.
Look, the fake news media, they always attack me whenever I say what I think about.
Well, maybe you shouldn't be so boorish when you talk about.
You know, you're not such a great example of yourself, Angela.
I don't like this type of locker room talk.
Please.
Donald, please, please. The least thing we need is for her to be more committed to.
What were we just listening to, and why puppets?
That was, of course, NATO, the missing word. And why puppets? Because everyone loves puppets. You asked me at the start of this interview about whether it was If You Lived Here, You'd Be Home Now is from that sign that you and I used to drive by. You and I used to watch The Muppet Show.
We sure did.
I mean, I don't know that about you,
No,
but it
did.
would have been weird if you hadn't
Along
watched
with
The Muppet
Zoom.
Show. Zoom, which was, of course, right there
Yep.
on WGBH,
Right.
Channel 2 in Boston. Yes. And I was
Rex
never on
Trailer.
Zoom. I tried to get on Zoom once.
Of course you did.
I failed.
You wanted to wear one of those striped shirts.
Yes, it was like kind of orange and red striped jumpers, which back
Like
in the 70s.
Big turtleneck.
Big turtlenecks, yeah, the whole thing. I didn't get
They
on
did
that.
not go to the Hoover Institution, the Zoom alumni. Maybe some of them did, though.
I'm willing to bet that none of them did, but they might have graduated to Mummenschanz, for example. that would be possible. Look, the Muppet Show was a fantastic, in my view, the most fantastic show, because it was completely accessible to young people, but it also was politically aware. It was intelligent, and you could talk about anything using puppets. It also wasn't cruel. It wasn't mean. It didn't take itself so seriously. It took the world seriously, but didn't take itself so seriously. And I love that. And I think, and that resonates really quite a bit with me. I take my work very, very seriously. I don't want the work I do to be crap. But I don't take myself that seriously. And if somebody, wants to take a piece out of me or says, they say they don't like something, it doesn't crush my self-esteem. It's okay. And I think that, being a political scientist with a PhD and a company and writing books and that needs to be leavened with puppets.
How do you intellectually draw the line between sort of the tone of these various channels? I mean, we just heard the puppets talking, but there's also your personal writing, the weekly note that now I've been receiving, Eurasia Group's Signal newsletter, the website, the social channels, the segments like Ben White in the 60 Seconds. I mean, it takes a different part of the brain to speak with humor, but also intellectual rigor.
Yeah, I guess they all have to feel authentic to me. I mean, ultimately, I need to know that voice is consistent. And you can say it's hard to do. It would be maybe hard for me to come up with rules of engagement that someone that didn't have any connection with me could then suddenly follow. I mean, if I were to get hit by a bus and someone else had to take this over, I suspect you would lose some of that voice because I'm so personally invested in it. But it's not hard for me to know what that voice is. And I think the culture that we have in the firm, my CEO, Alex Sanford, our chief creative, Alex Clement, Willis Sparks, who's worked with me for 16 years now, macro guy. I mean, we know this voice. We can do this. And, when someone comes in and is spewing a line, it suddenly becomes very dissonant. Like it's like fingers on a chalkboard. You can tell when you have a piece of content that doesn't work. So lots of different formats. Absolutely. I mean, puppets and, Ben White doing World in 60 are different formats, but they're functionally the same kind of content.
So, Ian, I'm looking at the image of you and your colleagues on the podium of the New York Stock Exchange, the big sign behind you, GZERO Media, a Eurasia Group company. You founded your company in 1998 to help investors and businesses understand how politics are and will impact foreign markets. Before you got to all of the different tracks for your authentic voice, what made you realize that political risk, historically isolated to government affairs, may have additional usage in the business world and academia?
It wasn't really a strategic plan. I didn't intend to start a company. I finished my PhD. I was 24 years old. I wanted to have a job, like not just be a professor, but have a job. And my advisor convinced me to stay at Stanford for a couple of years and called my mother when I said no and said, this guy's crazy. We're offering him to stay at Stanford. And, why would he say no? So I did it, but I didn't like it. When you've been in school for your entire life and, you've grown up with people that have jobs that actually work. I mean, my grandpa was a maintenance man. That's a job. I wanted to have a job. And so I quit. I moved to New York. And I met a whole bunch of people that were very nice to me that could have, I thought, given me a job. I met with Bob Hormats, who had been a former Assistant Secretary of State, but also was Vice Chairman of Goldman Sachs. I met with Frank Wisner, who had been ambassador to China and all these other countries, but then was Vice Chairman of AIG, again, right down the road. I met with Teddy Roosevelt IV, who was Teddy Roosevelt IV and Vice Chairman of Lehman Brothers. I remember all of these older white men who had these extraordinary positions and experiences, and they found what I did really interesting. They would take me for lunches. It was really nice, but they didn't have a job for me, at least not as a political scientist. They might hire me as an associate in investment banking, but I wanted to go work as a political scientist in their companies. And after a year of all of this great access, but no job, I finally went to one of them and said, look, you don't have a job for a political scientist, but you clearly find what I do interesting. If I were to just put a shingle out, would you hire me as a client? And I don't even remember who it was, but whoever it was said, sure. And that rang a bell in my head, said, oh, this is obviously the way I should have approached it. I went to all these other people, and within a week, I had commitments of all of these big companies like Goldman Sachs to become a client of my own little company that I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but was going to have some access to me. And they were generous with me with their time, and I was very responsive and listened to them. And as a consequence, I started a company. So first of all, you can say that I have an entrepreneurial spirit, but I wasn't an entrepreneur because I wasn't really taking risk. Right? I mean, there was no downside. I didn't hire any people. So it wasn't like I had a burn rate. Until I figured out the things that were going to make them happy as clients, I did not hire anyone. And if I didn't make a lot of money myself, as I didn't for the first several years, well, that was okay. Like, there are plenty of ways to make a couple bucks. In fact, I used to do expert testimony for people from the former Soviet republics seeking asylum. And the judges would want to bring me in as someone credible. And that was like $250 an hour. I could do that for a day or two a month. And that would pay for my rent and my food. And I didn't really need new clothes. And so that was enough, right? So literally there was no pressure on me to make this more successful than it was. And if you had asked me back in 1998, would it be successful? The answer is, of course it will be. I just don't know exactly what it will be. If you told me that in 2018 I was going to have the company I now do, the companies with this global reach, that's a little bigger than I would have expected. Yeah.
So mentors like Frank Wisner, Theodore Roosevelt IV, Bob Hormats, that's 20 years ago. But between 98 and 18, what are some of the sort of pivotal turning points for the Eurasia Group and Ian Bremmer that went from a couple $100 expert testimony on Soviet emigres to where you are now?
Well, one early one was later in August 1998 when the Russians defaulted and devalued. The fact that I had a pretty strong sense of why that was a possibility politically. I mean, they had the money to pay. They could pay, but they had very strong reasons not to, given like a prime minister that was, in his 30s and in the job for weeks, and a president that was increasingly absentee and drunk all the time. Like, there were political reasons to believe this was a problem. And a lot of people knew me and my work on Eurasia. That's why I called the firm back then Eurasia Group. Suddenly I was in the news around this issue and people paid attention. So that certainly helped. I mean, I don't know if you'd call it a turning point for the company, but it made a whole bunch of market participants on Wall Street and in London suddenly recognize that they should probably take a call from someone they hadn't heard from that was working with Goldman Sachs and Lehman and Bear Stearns, Another one would have been when I did my book, The J-Curve, in 2006, which was my first trade book as opposed to academic-y kind of books. And it was a pretty wonky book. It was talking about how countries do and don't fall apart. And it basically, one takeaway from it was that a country like North Korea, some countries are stable because they're open, like the US. So Trump can be president, but 2 years after Trump is president, the biggest takeaway should be that the institutions in America are really strong, that he's constrained. He can't do most of the things he tweets about, like it's a witch hunt. But he has no ability to slow down or even limit the Mueller investigations. Like that should be your takeaway. So America is strong and stable because it's open. But there are some countries that are stable and strong because they're closed, like Cuba and North Korea and even Iran. And that countries that are stable because they're closed have very strong incentives to stay closed. So when you say that you're going to punish them by isolating them, that isn't necessarily a useful punishment. So the book was about that and about this dynamics around how and why countries fall apart. And I thought it was important to get out there, but it became like this mini cult thing. I mean, Jon Stewart had me on The Daily Show, and the BBC did this big feature on it, and The Economist magazine named it Book of the Year, and all of this stuff from a political scientist that was kind of known in a boutique kind of way by these market participants, but I was by no means a household figure, and Eurasia Group was by no means a household name. Suddenly, we got a hell of a lot better known. And I would say that also over the period of these 20 years, you know, I've been really fortunate in finding other people that have been really willing to mentor me and mentor us and help provide a lot of support for the work we've done. I look at someone like Christine Lagarde at the IMF. I look at Yuriko Kawaguchi back when she was foreign minister of Japan. I look at a number of heads of state from all over the world. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General. I mean, just people who have, for different reasons, decided that someone who's willing to speak truth to power and an organization that supports that is useful, is valuable, deserves to be promoted, deserves some of their time and their advice. And as you know, if you're in a position like that, the single most valuable thing that you can offer, it's not money, it's not power, it's time. That these are people, everyone is trying to just get on their schedule. And so if you make sure that every single time you meet with them, whether it's for 10 minutes or an hour, that they're getting value from that, irrespective of whether you get no value at all. That's the most important thing you do. You cannot waste these people's time. And I think that that was a lesson that I learned early on from people like Frank Wisner and Teddy Roosevelt IV, and even from people like Tim Hansberry back when I was a high schooler traveling into Boston as part of my junior achievement shop.
How do you and your staff take a global trend like the erosion of institutions and parse it out into actionable advice for the current investors or companies that are part of your stable?
You know, what you need, I mean, we work with, AI, and we do native language social media scraping around elections that we've developed in-house. We certainly have a lot of data that we've collected and models. We've developed methodologies. But ultimately, the way you do this work, you require people that really know the folks on the ground. They have to understand, they have to be immersed in the cultures, in the political systems, in the way that these places work. So in the former Soviet Union, I speak Russian. I've lived there for 3 years. When I started the country, I was probably one of the best analysts on Kazakhstan. Who cares? Very few people. But I would have been able to tell you who the best locals were in Kazakhstan. I could find them, I could train them, I could hire them, and I did. And that really mattered if you were, let's say, Shell Oil Corporation, or if you were AIG and you had business in Kazakhstan. Now, I can't do that anymore. I haven't been to Kazakhstan in years, but my lead Kazakh analyst can and does. And same true with Indonesia and Brazil and all the rest. So I really think it matters to spend a long time developing your in-country credentials, bona fides, network, and you have to, that expertise, I mean, there's a reason why Malcolm Gladwell says it takes, sort of 10,000 hours, and over time, like if I spent 10,000 hours doing jujitsu, I would probably be pretty good at it. And if you're not, you should do something else. I mean, I've now been a political scientist. I got my PhD 25 years ago. That's a long time, right? And I've been at this firm for 21 now. I don't think it's arrogant to say that I actually have picked something up over that period of time. Like you're better at understanding how to do research, at how to recognize patterns, how to anticipate when something is plausible or not plausible. You don't have a crystal ball, but you do know the constraints on political drivers and decision making so that you can actually decide that certain things are just off the table. That other people say this could happen. You say, no, it can't happen. You predicting that? No, I'm just telling you that given what we know about these political actors, this series of events is not plausible. So take them off the table. And here are the important things to pay attention to that'll sort of be benchmarks for whether the politics are playing out the way you might presently be anticipating, which are very relevant to your economic exposure.
So, Ian, as we close and as you leave the New York Stock Exchange, it is now about 2 weeks left in 2018. You tease us that the 2019 top risks list is coming out. What can you share with our listeners about what we might see?
Well, what I will share with you is that the week before it comes out, which is next week, I always go back to what we said about the year last year. And I look through the entire report. We keep it on our homepage all year long. And we ask, how did we do? Right? I mean, where do we get it right? Where do we get it wrong? Why? And I think that's really important. I think the most important thing we can do as we get into a new year is a little bit of reflection and be honest, right? Because no one out there expects you to be right 100% of the time, but they do expect that you're going to actually learn from your successes and learn from your mistakes and actually, to the extent that you can share that with people, I think it's extremely valuable. So we'll find out where we are for 2019 at the beginning of January. But for now, I promise you we'll do our damnedest to make sure that we're hot washing 2018.
Ian, thanks so much for joining us in the Ice House.
My pleasure, man.
That's our conversation for this week. Our guest was Ian Bremmer, founder and president of the Eurasia Group and GZERO Media, which today celebrated its first anniversary here at the New York Stock Exchange. Follow Ian and his goings-on at Ian Bremmer and at Eurasia Group and at GZERO Media, or use Mr. Google to put your fingers on all of the content that we've been chatting about this morning. And if you like what you heard, please rate us on iTunes so other folks know where to find us. And if you've got a comment or question you'd like one of our experts to tackle on a future show, email us at icehouse@theice.com or tweet at us at NYSE. Our show is produced by Pete Ash and Ian Wolfe, with production assistance from Ken Abel and Stephen Portner. I'm Josh King, your host, signing off from the library at the New York Stock Exchange. Thanks for listening. Have a very happy holiday season.
Information contained in this podcast was obtained in part from publicly available sources and not independently verified. Neither ICE nor its affiliates make any representations or warranties, express or implied, as to the accuracy or completeness of the information and do not sponsor, approve, or endorse any of the content herein, all of which is presented solely for informational and educational purposes. Nothing herein constitutes an offer to sell, a solicitation of an offer to buy any security, or a recommendation of any security or trading practice. Some portions of the preceding conversation may have been edited for the purpose of length or clarity.